I'll call Andy first, I believe.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. So staff is bringing forward several items for you to discuss today regarding our shoreline management and beach nourishment programs. We've got several items to cover. The first item is regarding a project we've been scoping for Post-Dorian work. The board is familiar with that. We've going through the process to be obligated for FEMA funding to replace sand losses from Dorian. We've been working with our consultant to scope out a project that's achievable for the town. We wanted to review that with the board and get some discussion and consensus on how to move forward. There's several action items related to that. There's a budget amendment to approve funding for design and engineering for that work. There's also a capital project ordinance, a new capital project ordinance related to this project that would include this design and engineering costs and other planning costs associated with that work. Beyond the discussion on beach nourishment, we also have two items related to sand fencing and beach grass planting. And the town has budgeted money of $150,000 to do sand fencing and beach grass planting. We are proposing to break that money up into essentially $100,000 worth of sand fencing, and then proposing to use the remaining money to do a beach grass planting cost share program. And Kate Jones with the planning department is going to cover both of those items. So just getting started with the first item, I'm just going to briefly introduce this, and then mainly it's going to be David Ryan and Brian Joyner with Moffitt and Nickel covering what we're proposing for a Post-Dorian project. So as the board is aware, the documented sand losses from Hurricane Dorian were roughly 507,000 cubic yards. So we are going through the process to have those funds obligated. We did receive a state grant of $1.4 million, and based on some cost estimating, we assumed that would give us about another 93,000 cubic yards of sand. So if you look at the scale of that project over 10 miles of the town's beaches, that's a fairly small project with respect or relative to what the town's done in the past. That equates to about 12 cubic yards of sand per linear foot of beach over 10 miles. And as you know, we've usually had at least a 30 cubic yard project in our previous two projects. We've always tried to make the projects worthwhile and reach an economic fill volume. And so what we're really trying to do here is leverage the FEMA funding and the grant money to do a project that would reach an economic fill scale. So in order to do that, we're going to have to consider how to pay for the additional cost of that. We are currently in process of working through some alternatives for funding. Some of that would involve discussions with the county. Also would be looking at possibly adoption of some MSDs and some tax rates to go along with those that would fund probably much less substantial costs to property owners than we've done for our previous projects. We plan to review those funding alternatives with the board in January once we have more information on what we can expect in some of these other funding areas. We're talking to the county, that's ongoing. There's some moving parts there which the board's aware of, and so we're trying to work through some of those issues. Our goal for this project would be to reach a volume that would be able to extend the life of this work to roughly 2028. As the board is aware, the county's funding model had the town's maintenance project occurring in 2025. So the goal with this would be to extend it 3 more years and reach a volume that would equal that. The benefits there would be that if we did this project in 2022, we could tie in with the work that's being done in the other northern beach communities. And 2028 is also their planned maintenance cycle. And so what we've been working towards long term is that we can sort of align these projects and achieve economies of scale by doing that. So with that said, I think we're going to go ahead and turn to David and Brian to go over sort of the project alternatives we've come up with, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Good morning, Mayor and Board of Commissioners. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, just wanted to go ahead and give a brief overview prior to Moffitt and Nickel presenting their presentation of their initial planning efforts. So town staff has been working with Moffitt and Nickel, the town's coastal engineers, over the past several months to explore historical erosion rates and their relationship to different fill volume scenarios, as well as project longevity in review of the Post-Dorian restoration project. There are several memorandums which are included in your board packet, which provide some additional background information on their methodology in developing these different scenarios. Like Andy had said, understanding that additional discussion is going to be required for funding, it should be noted that proceeding with permitting for a fill volume which is greater than the base FEMA or coastal storm damage mitigation award amount, it does not obligate the town to commit to that particular volume at that time. It just establishes a maximum volume permit amount for which Moffitt and Nickel can move forward with as part of their permitting efforts. So our intent is to provide the board adequate background information for consideration of revised task order number 4 to initiate the planning and design process for the Post-Dorian restoration / town maintenance project. And we would ask at the end of the presentation and any follow-up discussion, we would ask for consideration of this of approval for this revised task order number 4 from Moffitt and Nickel. So at this time, I would like to introduce Brian Joyner and Johnny Martin of Moffitt and Nickel, who will be presenting the results of their findings.
All right, thank you, David. This is Brian Joyner. Good morning, everyone. Just real quick check, can you hear me clearly or do I need to move closer to the microphone?
Good. We can hear you very clearly. Thank you.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, so David, I think you're controlling the slideshow. If you can advance those for me. I think this is sort of the outline of the material we have. Andy and David have done a good job summarizing a bit of it so far. So some of it we'll go through kind of quickly. Maybe look a little bit more at the spatial distribution of losses due to Dorian. So there's one number in the 500 to 600,000 yard range, but that's not equally distributed throughout the whole beach. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the CSDM grant means to the project and go a little bit more into then some options for going forward with the beach nourishment to take advantage of the FEMA and the CSDM funding. And then as Andy said, use a little bit more or use more funding to get sort of more benefit, more efficiency out of the project. And at the end of that, we'll have a bit of an preview for next year on the overall beach nourishment master plan. So next slide, please. Just to kind of remind everyone of the timelines we're talking about, Hurricane Dorian occurred in September 2019. There was a nourishment project ended just before that. So we have an almost immediate pre-storm survey from August 21. And then FEMA declared the disaster on October 4th, about a month or so after the storm. And the town's Post-Dorian survey was then in November. Some other weather had happened since then, and then the FEMA package that was submitted took account of some of the additional erosion that had probably occurred since Dorian. And then the FEMA application and the CSDM application for funding for beach nourishment went in April. CSDM was awarded, the grant was awarded in October, and then it looks like a late spring, probably a late spring date for pending the FEMA decision to obligate funds for the town's Post-Dorian project. That's looking ahead based on some information we've heard from others involved in the same process. So next slide. Andy summarized that Dorian caused about 509 or 550, something like that, 1,000 cubic yards of sand loss, according to the surveys and the background erosion calculations. And you can see on the slide here that while this is the shoreline change, not the yardage lost, but with the northern part of the town, Reach 1 being on the left and Reach 4 further to the right, you saw between 70 and 100 feet, or 70 to 75 feet of shoreline recession in the northern majority of the town, reach 1, reach 2, but then getting into reach 3, which is closer to the southern end of the town and closer to the historical hotspots, shoreline change increased 100 feet and then 160, 170 down in the southern parts of the town. So a much different kind of result from the storm in those areas. And that's reflected on the next slide in the volume change per cubic yard. So the bars on the chart all look fairly similar. In fact, the bars are smaller in the hotspot, the southern part of the town where the erosion rate is usually greater. But if you look at the numbers, the cubic yard per foot numbers, in reach 1, reach 2, the northern parts of the town, they're relatively small, 5 to 11 cubic yards per foot. Reach 2, that number is about the average of what Andy mentioned would be put back using just the FEMA funding. But then triple that in the southern part of the town, 33 to 38, triple and more than that. So again, a much greater local impact on the southern part of the town. And I mean, y'all knew that from experience. I'm not saying anything new, but those numbers kind of come into play when we think about how much more sand might be needed to meet the town's goals and how to distribute that sand. And we'll get into those scenarios in a moment. Next slide, please. I think Andy covered this. It's just summarizing again. The total loss due to Dorian was about 509,000 cubic yards, or about 10 yards per foot. I won't spend much time on that. So next slide. Summarizing the FEMA amounts, the FEMA public assistance request was 12.9 million based on that 509,000 cubic yards and an assumed, I think, a $15 per cubic yard unit price with some mobilization, demobilization built in, or added on to that. And the CSDM grant request was higher than the 1.4 million, but the 1.4 million was awarded. And then David and I have discussed that, and I think there's some additional coordination to just confirm, basically confirm the volume back to the state that would go with that amount. And so those two things together would cover a sand amount. And this, I'll say we did our own independent, Sam Morris, who's on the call for us, did his own independent cost estimate or price estimate for this Post-Dorian project. And for the various scenarios we considered, we came up with a unit price of $12.50 per cubic yard instead of the $15 per yard, a little more favorable price. And that $12.50, we believe, could get you 620,000 cubic yards of sand with those combined FEMA and CSDM funds. But again, that's just using the funds that you've applied for and are pending. I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. I've gone through a number of slides and see if there's anything to ask at the moment.
One real quick. Why are you coming up with a smaller price per cubic yard?
I could try to explain that, but Sam, if you're on, if you would mind trying to explain more efficiently than I would how you came up with that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Just took myself off mute. I was starting to talk, but yeah, we just took a look at the 2019 Nags Head project and some other local North Carolina current, I guess, recent hopper dredge projects, and took those actual productions of the dredges and the cost and recent bidding history, and came up with a lower unit than what the initial FEMA application of $15 a cubic yard was for. And we took into account a couple of things I think Brian will get into is the depletion of the current area. I think we could even be south of the $12.50 a cubic yard number if we had more adequate borrow sources than what is currently permitted right now. But we took an overall look at your recent project and other recent North Carolina projects for hopper dredges, and that's where we came up with the $12.50.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Any follow-up questions on that, or any other questions on what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, this is Johnny to it. That I think is important just to note that that's not inclusive of mow demow. Correct, Sam?
Yeah, that's correct. There's a $4.5 to $5 million mobilization, demobilization cost on top of the per cubic yard unit rate.
Mhm. That was separate.
Thanks, Johnny, that helps me. Thanks, Johnny, that helps me understand it a little bit better. So the actual cost per cubic yard might be more. I'm trying to figure out the economy of scale here. And the larger the project, it would seem like the smaller the cost per cubic yard, but now we have a smaller project and the cubic yard price is going down. That doesn't include mobilization.
Mhm. So I'll take a shot at that, and I appreciate the question. It's one that Sam and I discussed too. With a project of this size, the 600,000 or so yards, it's, as Andy mentioned, it's not really the most efficient fill template on the beach. It's harder to control. There's losses that are going to happen anyway that aren't diluted by the larger fill template if you did a 25 or 30 cubic yard per foot project. So there's some inefficiencies on the beach, but because the project is relatively small compared to projects you've done before, there's plenty of sand left in the bar areas for that project. The dredgers don't have to feel like they're going to run up against limits in the bar area for that size project. So you get some efficiency there. As we'll see in a minute, we're using the same unit price for a larger project of 1.2 and or 1.5 million. With those, it's more efficient on the beach, but it starts to get to the limit. It starts to get toward what you've got available in the permitted bar area. So again, the dredger sees possibly some risk or at least some additional work there they have to do to get the last bit of sand to put on the beach. So computed two different ways for two different reasons, but ending up at about $12.5 a yard for all three scenarios.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add is in the packet, I think there was a sheet with the price cost that would maybe kind of get to what you're talking about, Webb, that kind of shows the overall cost per cubic yard, and it shows as we get how that number, the overall goes down. There's just with the 620 cubic yards, and I guess we'll go over this. It was about $20 a yard when you factor in mob demob, and then as you go down to the 1.4 million, it gets down to a loaded cost or total cost of 15.9 when you include mob demob. Over.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, or I'll just move forward?
Go ahead, Johnny.
All right. Next slide, please. There we go. So kind of leading into this. So what are the goals and objectives for the Post-Dorian project? Well, one is to restore the beach, but as we're doing that, I guess this could have been more like criteria. But one criteria would be to try to put in enough sand per cubic yard to make the beach placement efficient. And we're looking at, if you've done about 30 cubic yards per foot in the past, 20 to 25 cubic yards per foot is the lowest we'd really want to go to avoid some of the inefficiencies on the beach. And so we looked at what would that volume be to do a 20 yard per foot project. And also there was a criteria to try to time it, to try to do enough that the next beach nourishment could be pushed out to 2027 or 2028 instead of 2025, which would have been the plan. And that's to attempt to align or try to align that project with the other projects slated for about 2027, 28, the northern beaches, the other towns. And so taking those two criteria together of 20 yards per foot everywhere, and then extending the life of the whole project to 2027, 28, we came up with some scenarios which are started to describe on the next page. So to get to those volumes, you can see the number bolded near the bottom of the page of 1.23 million, 1.2 million. We looked at, or Nicole actually did this and did a good job with it, I think. We looked at the background erosion rates historically through this past summer's monitoring report, and overall throughout the whole project reach, the 10-mile reach, about 409,000 cubic yards per year of erosion as a background historical occurrence. And covering that amount to try to get through 2027, 28, we need an average fill density of about 23.1 yards per foot, which meets that 20 yards per foot criteria. And if you did that, if you just did it on average over the whole beach, the 10 miles, you'd come up with 1,225,500 cubic yards approximately of sand. But if we go to the next slide, what that doesn't do is it doesn't really get you, because the losses are faster in reach 3 and reach 4 in the southern part of the town. It doesn't get you necessarily 3 years everywhere equally. It gets you the overall background loss, but it wouldn't last for 3 years in the southern part of the town. To do that, we really need to increase the density, the fill density in the southern part of the town, to going from 20 up to 30 and then up to 42 yards per foot. Or how would you distribute that? Well, that would, this one distributes that. It gives more in the southern part of the town, the 20 yards in the north, the 30 in the middle, and 42 in the south. But that doesn't get you the 3 years to 2028, because the southern part erodes faster than that. So the next scenario is a bigger project around, next slide please, around 1.5 million. So to get the 3 years in the southern part of the town, you're looking in the table in the middle of the page, reach 3, reach 4 would need about 75 yards per foot to last that long, so that you could better align with the northern town's beaches. And that total, if we did the minimum in the north and then what's needed in the south for the 3 years, comes up with about 1,472,000 yards. So to sort of summarize, we've got 3 scenarios: the 609,000 yard FEMA CSDM project, the 1.2 million yard project that meets the minimum fill template, but kind of doesn't meet the 3 year requirement for the southern part of the town, we think. And then the 1.4 million, 1.5 million yard project that meets both those criteria throughout the town. Next page, please. There might be a summary. No, go back one, sorry. So let's stop there for a second. That was a lot of numbers. Any questions on those so far? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
no questions right now. Thank you.
Okay. So next page. This summarizes something we've already talked about, that we developed a cost estimate based on what Sam said. We carried a $4.5 to $5 million mob and demob and used the $12.50 per yard. Sam did mention the last bullet. It's important to mention, and Sam kind of alluded to it. For the future, taking the bar areas, the current ones and any future ones you identify, to a deeper dredge depth would probably result in an even better unit price, but it would take a bit more permitting time to accomplish the first time you do it. So, but next slide, please. I think we summarized so we summarized those 3 scenarios and the total cost. we may camp on this one for a minute. The scenario 1 doesn't really last you the 3 years, but does go with the FEMA and CSDM funds for a total cost of about 12.8 million. And that includes mob and demob. Scenario 2, 1.2 million, would have a total cost of about 20.3 million. It wouldn't last 3 years in the southern part of the town. In scenario 3, the 1.4, 1.5 million would be $23.4 million. And should last the 3 years to 2027, 28, barring that you'd also seek recovery dollars for. All right, next slide, please. Just so the last thing we have in there for Post-Dorian is an estimated schedule. Working backwards from the bottom of the chart over on the right, still looking at construction as expected or as planned originally, May 2022 to through the summer 2022 nourishment season. to accomplish that and to try to get, competitive bids, I'd like to look at bidding the project, advertising the project anyway, at the beginning of September of 2021, back to the left and in the middle of the chart. Before that, we obviously would start the permitting process and try to submit a permit application in March 2021. We've already been coordinating with DCM. They had some questions about re-permitting the old bar areas. We talked about whether new geotechnical information would be needed or how we would evaluate the bar areas to help them understand that it would be okay to re-permit them without taking a lot of additional data. And some of that you've already heard about, the additional bar area hydrographic survey, which will show us how they've changed since the last time they were used for nourishment. So those data will come back in January, we believe. We'll evaluate it, coordinate with DCM, and submit a permit application if all those discussions go well in March. And we're looking at an estimated 6-month permit timeframe. While that's going on, we reach out to the dredging industry. We work on design, reach out to the dredging industry, say July timeframe, so that they'll be aware of it. We'll have their feedback and be ready to advertise the project in September. And then permits would be secured, obviously before notice to proceed for construction. So I think that's it for Post-Dorian slide content. And I guess I'll pause again and see if there's any discussion or questions.
Board, any questions yet? Yes, Renee?
Did the project scope of work include sprigging after the project?
The dollars we've talked about so far in this presentation do not. They include the dredging and placement and grading of sand. It doesn't include fencing or sprigging, to my knowledge.
So,
and Sam Regina, FEMA doesn't actually cover that at this time, right?
If I can follow up on that, there is some level of sprigging and sand fencing as part of the FEMA Post-Dorian scope of work. I believe it's about $50,000 in sprigging, and I think there was a small amount, I think $3,000 as for the sand fencing, which was damaged during Hurricane Dorian. So there is some level. It's small at this point in time, and we're still trying to work through the numbers, get some answers from FEMA as to a overall scope for the addition of potential sand fencing and sprigging. And we hope to have some of those answers for you at the January meeting.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, so if we're ready to move forward a bit into the engineering of, right, so we, if there's no other questions on the actual project at the moment, I'll just kind of, I think David mentioned we'd talk about our Moffitt & Nichols scope of work to carry out the permitting and design task and help with construction phase. So we had submitted a proposal back in the late spring as part of our initial set of work order proposals for this task, and then updated it just recently on new knowledge, findings, in coordination with DCM, and the potential for a much larger project. Our scope generally covers design. It's updating the engineering design, new construction documents or new bid documents, and then updating the template to fit the town's preferred project size, how much cubic yard, and how do you want to distribute it. It includes
Brian, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
I need to interrupt you. We lost sound for a bit, and
Okay.
so I'll make a point and then ask you to start. We haven't been able to hear you for the last few minutes as you've talked about the scope of work. So I'm going to ask you to jump back, but one of the questions here is, so that we see a complete project cost picture, we will need to see the sprigging and fencing cost. That obviously obviously will be part of our decision. I didn't know if we were going to see that as part of your presentation or if that's coming separately.
It is there. That is not included in my presentation, other than what David mentioned being included in the initial FEMA request. But no, we don't have that in the slide content.
Okay. Let me ask you to wait. Let me ask staff. Andy, do you know when that's?
Well, obviously, they're just presenting the cost estimates for the construction of the Nourishment, and then we've got design costs. But we're going to need to go ahead and add the sprigging and fencing cost to this project. You know, we're going to have another discussion about this in January when we talk about funding. And so, you know, we can look at the scope, the appropriate scope of a fencing and sprigging project, most likely similar to what we did after the last project, maybe even refining that somewhat, and then we'll bring that back to the board and add that cost to this. You know, and then moving forward, once we get towards the budget adoption, we have a better picture of the funding, that'll be included in the project ordinance for this project.
So we're asking them to design a project that's only a partial picture of the project. Shouldn't everything be part of the total picture?
Agreed, and we will build the sprigging and fencing into this for sure. It's a discussion that we need to have. So,
With that discussion, as we talk about money, we're looking at 3 different scenarios that were presented this morning with different volumes for each scenario, which one project. Scenario 2 was 20.3 million. Scenario 3 was 23.4 million. I just have a concern about how we move forward without having total numbers, because that's how we're going to have to decide what MSDs are, what financing is, what the timeline is for the length of the financing on this project versus if we're looking at a 2028 project, or we're looking at a 3-year financing period, or 4. Well, that'd be a 5 or 6 year financing. How we're going to pay for everything, and when the 2019 money runs out, when does that financing end before we start taxing people again for another project, because you can't really overlap them. Right. I don't think you can really tell people we're going to pay for this project, and then we're going to add this project on top of it, and then this project.
I mean, you're exactly right.
If we do scenario 1, we really don't have to worry about MSD.
That's correct, but that's the project that's not going to last.
I know that, but
yes.
I just know where I'm headed.
In years, we may have already went that far past where we're gonna fill anyways.
I mean, if
All I'm saying is I need to know total numbers.
I understand. I'm just looking at scenario 1 right now as being something that's achievable without as many conflicting elements to it.
It also uses permitting too. You don't have to
Right.
go after all your permitting because the volume, you don't have to change your bar area parameters.
Right. And then that gets all that out of the way. Then you go and start looking at the MSDs in the next project. But maybe I'm ahead of myself.
I'm right there with you.
Saying what you're saying, I don't disagree, but we're being pushed to consider other scenarios.
I'm not.
That causes me financial angst.
I'm just saying, I'm not being pushed to look at any other scenario.
We need to make that clear to the engineers.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a board decision. I'm just saying stuff now before, I guess, we really get in that discussion.
Yeah. So let's back up, Brian. We did start a little bit of discussion there. I think, there you go. So you were describing the scope of work, I believe, when we couldn't hear you. So if you'll pick up from there, thank you.
Okay, sure. And I will say before I forget to say it, our task force scope one that's been updated to reflect the potentially larger project and to cover some of that, or to cover that possibility. We would update the engineering design for the beach nourishment template to match that. And I mean, the drawings themselves could include, areas of sprigging and sand fencing. It's just we didn't include the actual construction dollars of sprigging and sand fencing in the numbers we presented this morning. But the drawing of sprigging and sand fencing could be in these same plans. So along with the design, which we would be taking forward, we'd be permitting the project, submitting environmental permit applications. We've already been coordinating with DCM. As I mentioned earlier, we got some of the feedback that you've already heard about. As the project is being permitted, we take it through final design, multiple submittals for towns review, and then to construction bid documents. Sam, and with our support, be reaching out to dredging contractors on industry day to get their feedback and let them be aware of the project, answering their questions. And then we'd also help the town evaluate the bids and make recommendations on award. And then once construction starts, based on discussion with town staff, and I think things we've heard from the board, we would be providing sort of the typical contractor review of contractor submittals and RFIs, but also spending time on site doing construction observation and weekly meetings and reviewing their placement and payment surveys as they come in to understand how the project is actually playing out and adjust, make any adjustments needed. We've definitely seen the need to do that in past projects to keep things moving smoothly. And then as the project closes out, as the project proceeds and closes out, reviewing the contractor's payment volumes to give the town advice on those if needed. So that's generally our scope, kind of full service from starting where we're at to prepare the design, help get the permits, and then be available during construction to see the project completed. And then move into the next slide. Other items of work that are not in our task force scope of work that have been discussed separately is the borrower area hydrographic survey that the board looked at earlier in December and approved. I understand the surveyor is looking for a time when they can actually get out to the borrower areas given the weather recently and do a successful survey, and then we would be analyzing that data as it comes back and discussing the findings with DCM. Not scoped yet, not priced yet, but if depending on how the borrower area survey comes back and discussions, DCM may or may not require new geotechnical borings and data analysis to re-permit the same borrower areas. If enough has changed out there since the last time some of them were used, in 2011, then DCM may require new field investigations. And so that's something we've been in contact with a contractor about, going to get those samples, but it's not scoped in any of the work orders so far. And we think that would add another 3 months or so, 3 to 4 months to the permitting schedule if we had to go get that data. Next slide, please. Okay, go back one, please. So that concludes that summarizes our Post-Dorian scope, that task 4 that David and Andy mentioned. Any questions on those?
Not seeing any, thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, next slide, and we're almost done with this presentation content. We're moving from the from Post-Dorian and the more sort of shorter term construction project to just sort of a summary of the overall beach nourishment master plan that we've been working on for the last several months. Year 1, which started in June, we'd be completing that in the spring and have some deliverables for you and some preview deliverables earlier than that, in the early part of next year, or early part of 21. We've completed the data analysis of the data provided by Coastal Science Engineering and data from the previous projects, and we've completed some longshore change modeling and gotten far in the cross-shore profile modeling to show how much sand is needed and what the level of protection will be. We're still working to finalize those numbers. We've looked at historical data to determine a long-term sand needs. We've got a good sense of, for a multi-decadal project, what the numbers are looking like with sand needs. Still need to finalize those, but they're close. And those would all be data points that would help plan out and scope what's needed for next year and where the project goes. So a little bit of a preview for year 2, which would begin in summer 2021, if approved. We begin to coordinate more with the town and the public on what we're seeing in terms of nourishment intervals and sand needs and how that might be obtained. We would need to identify some additional sand sources. We know that to cover the long-term needs, and we would ask the board to authorize us to do some field investigations and analysis to go sort of search out and characterize those borrow areas, like geophysical surveys and archaeological, and we would be coordinating with the permit agencies to make sure that all lines up. And while we're doing that, we're going to continue to model to adjust the findings, to adjust the nourishment needs and thresholds based on what we hear as we're coordinating with you and your public. I think that's the general summary of what we'd be doing next year, and we'd certainly write a more detailed scope of work for that for you later on for approval, review and approval. That, I think, concludes the presentation content. Happy to discuss any further.
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
I just have one thing. If I remember correctly, and this goes back years ago, but when we first started this, the sand source we identified was supposed to be between a 50 and 100-year supply sand source. So my question is, why are we looking at a new sand source?
Did you hear that question, Brian?
I did. And it's a good question. I don't personally have that knowledge of the previous discussion long ago of the 50 to 100-year sand source. It's something I could go investigate. But Johnny, from what you've read, or Nicole, from looking at the past documents, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I guess what the way I kind of read it is, I mean, yes, the larger, or the areas kind of denoted are, should provide that material for that long, but it just gets to the point of, as far as how much work was done to meet the current testing standards, for DCM and the permitting for each one. So I think that there was some general investigations done, Webb, for that, and kind of spacings of vibrocores were wider than what would be needed for, the 1,000-foot by 1,000-foot. So I think what we're saying is it's not a new area. It's just, providing the work that's needed for permitting to where it meets the current testing criteria, if that makes sense. We're having to go back. Go ahead.
So we're not looking for new sand sources. We're just confirming that the sources we have identified meet standards.
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing is there was a wider, wider vibrocore spacing that does not meet the 1,000 by 1,000 criteria. And so what we're doing is then kind of expanding where you've been dredging before, still within that originally denoted area. But in order to get the permits, you have to go back and do that additional work for the expanded area that you're wanting to use each time, if that makes sense. Over.
Yes, it makes sense. I've been in government long enough that it makes sense.
All right. Anybody else? Renee?
Based, looking at the screen that you have up there now, with the 3 different scenarios on it, it doesn't appear that each of the scenarios reaches the 2028 alignment of beach nourishment projects that we're working on to probably join with other communities. Is that right?
That's correct. It looks like 3 would meet that criteria, but the other 2 would not meet that criteria, certainly not everywhere. Scenario 2 would get closer, but it would, we think there'd be more erosion in the southern part of the town that wouldn't keep the, wouldn't meet the threat, would need to be nourished before 2027, 28 to keep the same sort of level of service on the beach.
But scenario 3 would, correct, Brian?
Scenario 3 would, yeah. Scenario 3 was set up to meet that 3-year criteria.
I have a question. Looking at your task order for $823,822, how does that change depending on which scenario? Does that particular task order change with regard to which scenario we choose?
I'll start that and then I'll ask Johnny to kind of speak to anything I leave out. The short answer is the first several parts of it, the engineering and the permitting really aren't that different. But the part that could be different is the construction phase services. A 1.5 million yard project should take longer to construct than a 600,000 yard project. And we've got budget in there to help you through construction with a 1.5 million yard project. If the duration is, we assumed a 4 to 5 month project duration for that. If the duration was a lot less because of a smaller project, then what we'd have to charge for that construction administration would be less.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there might be some savings too up in the permitting aspect of it as well in task 2. But some of those, some of it is once you crank up the machine to do it, and especially too, if we still are planning, even if you were to go with scenario 1 with the smaller volume, if you were still wanting to do the whole town with it, just we're still having to generate the same number of plans for that. It's just so there's not so much cost savings and those kind of things between it. But where as Brian said, the construction observation task, as well as the some of the task 2 or some of the engineering permitting would be less with scenario 1 versus scenario 3. Over.
Mayor, can I ask a clarification?
Yes, please.
Brian or Johnny, could you just explain how the FEMA reimbursement process addresses these task orders and potentially looking at the 3 different scenarios for David?
Okay, Johnny, can you take a shot at that one? Can you cover that one for me, please?
Yeah, so I guess.
Just how the Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, so my guess is that the current if we get the news back from either late spring or whenever that is from FEMA that the funds will be obligated, between that and the state funds, it should cover all of the cost of scenario 1. So then you're kind of looking, and I hope this is kind of the answer to your question. So, then it's looking at, okay, the additional cost to go to scenario 2 and 3 would be what would have to be sort of borne by, a combination of town funds and, county funds within that. So then you're kind of looking at the, roughly $8 to $11 million, for Delta cost that would then have to be borne by town and county funds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in terms of the design, we had a discussion the other day about design and permitting costs being covered by FEMA. And so I guess it just comes down to the original question the board asked, which is, how much of the task order is devoted to FEMA versus purely a town scope? And so what would we really be looking at out of pocket from the town versus FEMA in this task order? I mean, you may not have the answer to that right now, but just a question.
Yeah, what I could say is that in some of the other projects that we've done, especially if it's going to be, we've not seen we've seen FEMA cover all the cost of engineering and permitting. Even if the towns were to decide to put additional volume on that, they just haven't in the past required going down to that level of granularity as far as splitting up that prorating those costs. But that's just been on past experience. The rules at FEMA are always kind of changing, so that might change. But some of the, I think if we were if we were asked to then provide that differential, you know, I think it would just really be the town portion would be the additional time to place the material on the beach, and maybe just some of the additional permitting time for that additional volume. But I can't imagine it would be, you know, if you're asking me for a rough idea, I mean, I would think that the most that the town would have to come up with on this task order, if anything, would be, you know, maybe 20% of the total. That's just, again, we'd have to go back and do the official calculation, but I mean, that's just a number that kind of seems like would be reasonable.
Well, let me rephrase this a little bit. Today, we will have a motion shortly to approve the engineering and task order, which right now stands at $823,822. That's fine. Holidays, you're not going to do anything between now and our January meeting anyway. So if we have additional discussion with additional information about the full scope of the project, whether it's scenario 1, 2, or 3, we're obligated to a minimum of $823,822 anyway.
No matter what scenario.
No matter what scenario. And regardless of how it's paid by FEMA or anybody else, I mean, basically we're gonna obligate ourselves in some way to $823,822 today, regardless of what scenario we're looking at. Is that correct?
Yeah, or I think you could maybe say, you know, up to that amount, and then if you want to adjust the contract to be lower as some of these other things come into play, then I think we could always be amenable to do that. So, I mean, we won't be.
Right.
Does that make sense? I mean, I think that way it gives you the freedom to, if we, you know, depending on what we find out, you know, with discussions with the county and with FEMA, if we need to kind of pull back a little bit, since most of the delta costs would be during construction anyway, you know, we could always adjust and lower the contract amount at that time, if that makes sense.
That seems reasonable, yes.
That's the most extensive part of this task is 352,000. It's construction, observations, and administration, and it's a shorter construction, less observation, less administration.
Right. All right, thank you. Appreciate that.
And
Board, any other questions?
If I could, I just wanted to go ahead and provide some clarity on some of the numbers that have been provided. For scenario 1, Moffitt and Nickel had originally submitted design fees in the amount of $717,512 for a Post-Dorian project, which encapsulated the FEMA portion and I believe the CSDM portion, and Johnny or Brian can go ahead and correct me on that. So with scenario 1, if the board were to opt to move forward with that, there would be a $106,310 reduction in design fees from the $822 that is currently being requested. So to summarize, scenario 1 would be less in cost as far as design fees. Scenario 2 and 3 would be equivalent, either scenario the board chooses to move forward with. Can you just go ahead and confirm, Johnny or Brian, that is accurate?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And thanks for bringing that up, David. That is just, I couldn't remember the exact number we had done, but you know, the other thing too is we're always guessing how long they will be out there. And so, you know, again, that's just something that as we get into that, we can always just not bill to the full amount or whatever else. I mean, the biggest unknown to us is, you know, how long it's going to take them to do the project. So that's always something that we can adjust in the future. But yeah, that is what I think we assumed three months before, and this time we assumed 4 months. Brian can correct me if I'm wrong. So, but we can always adjust that depending on, what the actual schedule comes out to be once we know the contractor and what their schedule is. Over.
Yeah, just to confirm, Johnny, those are approximately good assumptions. And yeah, I agree. We could adjust the price for that construction observation task once, the contractor provides a schedule, and we understand that.
Board, any further questions on this? John, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Do we want to, let me ask the board, do we want to review and have a discussion of these other issues, the budget amendment, the beach nourishment capital project ordinance, and then go back and make motions to approve them? Or do you want to, are you willing to go ahead and take this one without having to review those?
I feel verbally that I would hope that we all read them
Yes.
as we came in, but
Sure.
I'm fine with taking them one at a time as we move on.
Okay. In that case, then I think a motion would be in order to approve the engineering and design task order for up to $823,822.
I make a motion to approve a task order contract with Moffett and Nichols not to exceed $823,822.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Mayor, you said 23, the mayor asked it's 32.
822 is what I took off her.
Well, then they've got a conflict because there's another section that they asked for 32.
I'm just looking at the task four.
Ordinance, I see what you're saying, but it reflects 823, 822.
The correct number is 823, 822. There was a typo in the summary sheet, and my apologies for that.
That's right.
That's what I should say.
Yes.
No, that's what you said. I apologize for
That's okay.
interrupting. Yes. But there's
So,
a conflict in the numbers.
823, 822.
So I still reiterate my motion.
Yes.
Okay.
Have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. All right. Thank you. Then the next item on our agenda would be consideration of the budget amendment to approve funding for the new beach nourishment capital project ordinance. Andy, does anybody need to speak to this?
I don't know if Amy's on the Zoom. I think she is. Maybe Karen, if you could get Amy to just briefly explain what's included in the capital project ordinance and what we're doing with this.
Thank you, Amy.
Hi. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to keep both capital project ordinances open right now because we still have some outstanding work. I think from Moffett and Nickel doing some engineering, but essentially what I'm proposing is just to kind of start fresh with the Dorian project. I've captured the engineering contract in there. We're going to just kind of cut off the legal fees at this point and put that and start coding all the legal fees into the new ordinance, as well as capturing the fencing and the sprigging that we had discussed and leaving in a contingency for emergencies. And that will be funded at this point through the capital reserve fund, barring any FEMA funding, that it will have amendments and adjustments as we go forward. But this is just to kind of move the cash into that fund so we can get it going.
Thank you. Board members, Renee?
Does this capital ordinance for sand fencing and sprigging include the cost to do it with the Post-Dorian project, or does it include the cost that we're talking about now?
No, ma'am, I believe it it just includes the sprigging project that Andy had spoke about earlier for the reimbursement program that we're talking about. And then I think the sand fencing for the 100,000 is just what we're looking at doing now. But it doesn't capture anything in correlation with the project or after the project, because I hadn't received those numbers yet. So I think it would just be just to start doing that right now. And correct me if I'm wrong, David Ryan.
So are we mixing money in this project ordinance that you said was establishing a Post-Dorian project with the project that we're considering in the 2021 budget year?
Are we mixing, I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question. Are we mixing money? This is all funded through the Capital Reserve Fund. And none of this was originally budgeted. So this is all new. It's money that we have in the Capital Reserve, but these are kind of new projects that we have discussed and want to fund. So we would do them, I think now, is that correct, David and Andy? The sand fencing?
Correct.
Yeah, that's what I understood.
We are combining projects. I mean, we have, yeah.
So it was said that this was all going to be a Post-Dorian project ordinance. That's what I'm saying, is the money that we're doing now going to be considered part of the Post-Dorian project, and then we're going to have to add more sprigging and sand fence to the next project that we do, which is still Post-Dorian project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, at some point, I could certainly, I think we still have, I'd have to look at the capital project fund. If your preference would be to keep those two pieces out of this ordinance, I could change that. I think at just some point, I know when I started the initial, when I set up the ordinance that we're in right now for the Matthew, I think at just some point, when I had talked to the auditor about it, we just kind of said at some point you just have to cut it off and start it new just to keep looking forward. So I think that was just kind of the approach I took, is that at some point you just have to cut it off and start new. But if the preference would be to use it from the old ordinance, I think that there's still funding there that I wouldn't need to do a budget or any adjustment to the ordinance. So that was just kind of my approach, is kind of just to cut it off at some point and just start moving forward with a new project.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that we would like to see this capital project ordinance out the 100 and the 50. Those are actually post-Matthew?
Yes.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Well, I think the sprigging is part of the new, the 50,000 for the sprigging is part of the, I think we'll speak to that later, as part of the cost share program. That's kind of what we had set aside for the cost share. So I guess that would be up to the board which ordinance they would want to include that with. I guess I just don't want to keep two ordinances. I don't want to keep the ordinance dragging on for too long, just for kind of a nominal amount of money in the grand scheme of things. So, but certainly we could include it in whichever one you want. But the 50,000 is for the new project that, the cost share project.
They asked for 100,000 cost share project. Numbers are put in.
My only concern is I don't want us to get down the road and we start awarding the Dorian money. We're going to say, oh, we've already spent the sand fencing and sprigging money. Because it's going to have to be put in that ordinance at some point in time so that we can see the total cost of what Post-Dorian is going to be.
Right.
Well, it's not a significant amount to affect the bottom line.
Okay, I'm looking it up right now. Capital. Sorry, I'm just checking to make sure how much money is left in the ordinance. So we have, in the current ordinance that we're in for sprigging, we have about $150,000 left. So we could certainly you know, if that was the direction you wanted to take, I could just strike off those amounts and just for the sprigging and the fencing and put them in the, you know, just pay for them out of the old ordinance. If that would be the direction that the board would like to take.
If it's available, I believe that's what we're saying.
Yes, and then I'm just looking at the fencing and there's about I'm sorry, I'm looking at my other screen. There is about 116,000 left for fencing. So I could certainly do that without needing to take any adjustments to the old ordinance and just, you know, if we needed to do the contract approval, once we get that, that would be it. But I can certainly strike that off and just fund the engineering and contingency. And is the board okay? Would the board have a preference of moving forward with like the legal fees? Are you okay with just kind of cutting those off and starting with a new ordinance? There's kind of really no end and beginning to those. I guess that would be my only other question is it okay to keep the legal and professional fees in there?
Yes, I think so, because, you know, a lot of those are applicable to easements that we're.
That's correct. That's very much correct. Yep. So I can just strike off the fencing and the sprigging, pay for those from the old ordinance. And
So in that case, we would be approving this new capital project ordinance for the amount of $1,518,822.
yes, sir. That's what I was just calculating. That's what I came up with. Yes.
I'll make that motion.
Second. Okay, so I have a motion and a second to approve this new beach nourishment maintenance capital project ordinance in the amount of $1,518,822, which leaves out the sand fencing and sprigging, understanding that they're being accomplished out of the previous ordinance. So we have that motion from Commissioner Cahoon. There was a second from Commissioner Brinkley. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, we skipped the budget amendment. We went straight to the capital project ordinance. Also a budget amendment that we need to approve.
Sorry, the budget amendment will be adjusted as well, since we took out the $150,000. I don't know if you can hear me.
We do.
Okay.
All right. So that would be, Amy, that would be on both sides on the budget amendment request, both total charges and total credits would be reduced by 100,000.
Yeah, 150,000. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it would just be the same in that we wouldn't fund the 150,000 from the capital reserve. So the capital reserve fund would only be funding it for $1,518,822 in both directions. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, do we need to have a separate budget amendment for the 150,000 to come out of, once we get through that, to come out of the current budget ordinance, or is that already established?
No, ma'am. I just checked the budget and there's still money left to accomplish both the sprigging and the fencing projects out of the old ordinance. So no action would be needed other than just to approve a contract once we get that. So from a budgetary standpoint, we're okay for those two items.
So then a motion would be in order to approve this budget amendment request in the amount and double check me, Amy, it looks like $3,187,644.
One, six, six, nine. Yep, I'm double checking right now. Oh. One, 5, sorry.
318,764.
3,376,644. That would be just the total of both funds.
$3,187.
I got 3,187.
All
on the same page.
Yeah.
Amy, are we not reducing this budget amendment request?
Yeah, we're reducing it. 3,037,644.
Took out 300,000, come out to 3 million. Should be 3.187 million.
Taking 150 out of each one of those projects. Out of the reserve fund and the project funds, you took 150 out of each. And left
Right,
that 150
essentially,
in.
you would take subtract the original total was 3,337,644 dollars. So you would just subtract 300,000 from that total.
Good, I'm sorry, yes.
I'll make a
So it'd
motion
be
to approve the budget.
I'm sorry.
I would make a motion to approve the budget amendment request in the amount of $3,037,644.
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If you're all those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
The next item is consideration of the town sand fencing project. I don't know if you want to discuss these together, Andy, or whoever's going to speak to this, the grass planting cost share program.
I think Kate Jones was going to handle both of these, so she could just kind of roll from one to the other, if that's okay.
Okay, yes, thank you, Kate, if you will.
Hey, y'all, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, good morning, board and commissioners. Hope you're all doing well today. It's good to see you. So I'll start with the sand fencing, as that is up next. But before I do that, if it's okay with you guys, I wanted to provide an update on the hay bales that were installed earlier this year in April. As you may remember, we initiated a pilot project to see how well hay bales would perform on the beach. So we actually installed hay bales, if you've been out there recently, at Junco Street. And we did this around the same time the sand fencing was going in, but we did about a half of a mile of hay bales from Juncos north, so half a mile north. And we placed these on the upper portion of the beach, basically in the same configuration as sand fencing. So it's interesting, you can actually see them compared to the sand fencing because they're sand fencing, contiguous on both sides of them. Overall, I would say the hay bales were successful in capturing sand, although I think staff would agree that perhaps they weren't as efficient as sand fencing. But overall, they did capture sand. We did have some issues with some of the variability of sand capture. It was not as consistent as sand fence would be. Additionally, we did have some problems with the bales actually toppling over in some locations. However, they really did stay in place. They did not move from their footprint because they actually are not anchored into the ground. So some of these things you have to take consideration where you place them. However, they were successful, although not quite as successful, at least in this location, as the sand fence was. And actually, if I can share my screen, I have a few pictures if y'all are interested in seeing. I'm not sure, Karen, if, let me try to share my screen real quick. Can y'all see those?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through real slowly. This is actually the northern limit. You can kind of see the sand fencing and then give way to where we placed the actual hay bales. So you can see they have collected a bit of sand there. But as you'll see as the pictures go on, well, that's just the sand fencing. That's looking south. And there is some variability. You can see some of the bales have actually, become dislodged a bit. But for the most part, they're all still there. So, they really have performed. It's just a little more highly variable than the sand fencing. Okay.
Kate, what is the relative cost of hay bales versus sand fencing for the same linear feet of beach?
Well, that's something we're looking into. And I will say Cliff handled most of the costing of the hay bales, so I'm going to have to get in touch with him and ask him, or get in touch with his supplier. But I would imagine, they're depending on the cost of transport, and the labor was probably a bit easier considering there's no anchoring into the ground and less materials and probably less time. So I would imagine they may be a little bit less than sand fencing, but I can find a number on that. He handled most of the costing for that. Let's see if there's
May I
anything
ask
else.
a weird question?
I have a question from.
Just a weird question. How are the bales put together? Are they tied with twine, or do they have some sort of metal in them?
That's a good question. They're actually tied together with a twine, yep, sort of a tough, thin rope. And it's starting to biodegrade now. I imagine it's actually a nylon, so I'm not sure it biodegrades completely. Whereas obviously the rest of the hay bale would biodegrade, but they are tied together very thinly. But in some cases it wasn't enough to actually hold, as you saw in a couple of those pictures, to hold the bales in place. But they're tied together, but they're not anchored into the ground like a post would be.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for?
So we could explore this more in the future, based on what makes sense, and if the board would like us to continue to look for places throughout town where we could explore using hay bales, if the board would like.
Well, I have a question from Commissioner Kate.
Kate, I have a question. In the memo about the consideration of town sand fencing, it talked about would extend to the vicinity of Enterprise Street. Where does it start? Where did the last project end? It didn't address where this part goes.
So that's a good segue, I guess, into the actual sand fencing. To answer your question, this past year in 2020, around April, the sand fencing started at the southern corporate limits and went to about June Street, which is well north of Juncos, but not quite to the pier, the Outer Banks Pier. So we got to June Street basically. So this year, or 2021, we're talking about initializing, as we've been talking about today, another sand fencing project, which we have $100,000 set aside. We could start at June Street and work north. And with that amount of money, I think we've estimated we could get about 4 miles, which would take us to about the Village Beach Club. with 1 row of sand
Thank
fence. Does that answer your question?
Enterprise, where does enterprise come into play? I mean, it really doesn't answer your question.
Well, Enterprise is,
North of this.
Enterprise is
North.
directly north of the beach club.
Right.
Enterprise is further down by Nags Head Inn, or Holiday Inn.
Yeah, it's way down there. It's another
It
mile.
was Loggerhead then Enterprise.
It is, and Loggerhead's down here by,
Loggerhead. Some streets have been renamed, by the way.
Do what?
As I found out when somebody was trying to rent a house, some streets have been renamed over the course of time. Yeah, I didn't know that either. So trying to find a house that doesn't, the maps didn't reflect the street name.
She might be referring to the beach access, the village private beach access as opposed to the beach club.
Well, which one?
And these are rough estimates at this point. It will obviously depend on the cost per panel, per unit that comes in when we bid this out, but roughly 4 miles north of June Street.
Enterprise is north of us, whereas the beach club is south.
Thank you. Kate, do you have anything else to bring us about the sand fencing? We haven't really talked about the beach grass planting cost share yet, but anything else to tell us about sand fencing?
I guess, no, just that this would be something we would put out to bid after the first of the year and try to, get someone under contract to initiate this work and have plenty of time to put in the estimated 4 miles of sand fencing well before the cutoff for vehicles on the beach. So that would be the goal, and I think we have plenty of time to do that. So that's probably it at this point. We'll be working on that RFP to put that out.
Thank you. Then I guess is the request for this to approve a sand fencing project in the amount of $100,000?
Yes, the request to use that money in this way.
I'm sorry, yes. 100,000 in town funds plus $24,000 from their county.
Correct.
Thank you. Then a motion would be in order.
motion. Approve as requested.
I mean, the budget, the money was already there for that.
Okay.
We're just saying we're correct.
Yes. Yes. This is to formally move forward.
Another point of clarification, I was very interested in hearing the hay bale expense of the hay bale project. I don't think we have to call the former manager to find out. I think we can probably find out with finance. It don't have to be done now, but I do hope, I'm interested in.
I'm interested in the cost differential, as well as, it always interests me from an environmental standpoint, because the sand fencing makes an awful lot of debris on the beach.
Yes.
That is hazardous to children running up and down our clean beaches.
Kate, I would suggest that, having completed that hay bale pilot project, that, at least a minimal report of the relative cost, when you have that information, and,
Sure.
what recommendations staff might make about where those are appropriate going forward, because they are more environmentally friendly. I will also add in there, if we decide to do this again, if you would explore options for the twine for natural material instead of synthetic, because that material blowing around the beach and getting in the water is not healthy either.
I
Okay.
know some people are creating their own type of sand fencing using horsehair to tie it together so that they don't like the metal.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second to formally approve proceeding with this project. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Right, Kate, that brings us to our last item on this part of the agenda, which is the beach grass planting cost share.
Yes, thank you. So you all have the material in your packet, and as was mentioned before, we'd like to initiate a dune vegetation cost share program that would be basically for oceanfront homeowners to revegetate or vegetate with native dune grasses, the frontal dune area. And this program would essentially be a pilot project. So, anything we learned this year that isn't working or we think could improve, there'd be an opportunity if the board chooses to fund something like this again, to make adjustments as needed. But basically the dune vegetation cost share would be on a first come, first served basis. And as we've discussed, there's a $50,000 available already set aside for this program. Any homeowner, oceanfront homeowner, would be eligible, and there would be a 50% reimbursement of plant material. And then there would be a maximum amount per homeowner of $500. And we think that this amount would be appropriate, as it would work to spread this money throughout various homeowners throughout the town for maximum impact. The application period could start soon. As you all may know, the cool season beach grass planting window is open, and that is American beach grass, and that will essentially run through March. After that, it would switch to homeowners would have an opportunity to plant a warm season grass such as sea oats at that time. So essentially they'd have a pretty large planting window. It's just that the species would change for that. And that could be, we could determine that when they apply. We were envisioning an online application similar to the existing sand relocation application, which is live now and accepting applicants. So it would be very similar to that. And I think there would be an opportunity to work closely with the homeowners, make sure they understand, the expectations, and the idea would be that we would help them, but also to really get a good product. So if you all have any specific questions about the procedure or budget or application, just let me know.
Just one quick one. In die-out areas, you're not recommending replacement with beach grass. You're recommending like sea oats and stuff like that.
So when you say die-out areas where plants have been lost, is that right?
I was just reading here. Well, let me see if I can find it.
Mm-hmm.
Says basically, although it grows quickly where sand accumulates on the seaward side of the dune, tends to die behind the dune crest after a few years. This die is caused by climatic effects, disease, or insects, and dead patches of beach grass should be replaced with sea oats, bitter pansium, or seashore elder. And those, at least a couple of those, aren't native to the area or not. They've been naturalized, but they're not native. But I just wanted to know why we were recommending those instead of beach grass.
Well, I think that particular procedure is for if there's a reason the beach grass has died out, that maybe it's not a good idea to go ahead and plant the same thing if it's already gone and not surviving there. So in that case, sea oats and bitter panicum have been known to actually be somewhat more successful in trapping sand, but of course they have to be planted at a certain time of the year. So I think that's sort of the recommendation, that if you're and of course, it all depends on the situation locally, and we would handle that on a case-by-case basis when we're discussing it with the homeowner. But if for some reason you've planted beach grass before and it's died out, it's probably a pretty good rule of thumb that, you know, maybe you try the sea oats and bitter panicum mix, and you may have more success with that.
Any other questions? How quickly can this roll out? Okay, understanding that, you know, we're at the holiday season here, and the season, you know, the cool season is through March. Can this be effective and up and running in January?
I think so, yes. I think the last piece is just getting the application up and ready to accept applicants. And the fact that we already have the template for that, it shouldn't be very difficult to do. And then, of course, just advertising it well enough that the people understand it's open and that we're ready for people to apply.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anything else to say? I think a motion to endorse this.
Well, I would love to endorse this, but I actually feel that with the amount of tax the homeowners currently pay on the oceanfront, the $500 max, I think we decided if they want to pay for it, they plan it, we reimburse. I think we might have more success.
Regardless of the amount?
$500.
Oh, okay.
It's not getting now. You're taking 11 cents, is it now? I'm not an ocean.
Well, it was actually 18. I guess it dropped down some. All I know is the amount's still the same.
13 cents. They pay the abundance of it. And why not give them, they're already paying into the system. You got excess of $100,000, $50,000. Why not, you want to plan it, fine. It makes it easier on us. The benefit to us is we're not paying labor. They're putting it in. The same thing with Donnie King's, Better Beaches. You know, he's asked for $25,000 every year. We give it to him late, or if we give it to him at all as a town. Other towns are already having it done. They have volunteers to do it. The hardest part is organizing the contract or get somebody to do it. You know, my thought is, we've already got it, it's budgeted there. They pay the taxes, it's their money. They're protecting. They want to get out there and plan it, let them plan it. If they wanted to do it, they probably, and they had the means and the time to do it to begin with, they probably would have already done it. They wouldn't have asked for a 50% reimbursement. That's just my stand. I mean, I'm all for it, but that's my stand.
You're suggesting a flat, not a match, not worrying about whether they planted $1,000 worth of material or not.
If they plant 1,000, I don't care if it is a match. I mean, as long as it's done and the work's done, verify the work, verify the receipts, pay it. I mean, that's where I'm at with it. I mean, the board may not feel that way, but.
You said 1,000, but you're saying up to $500
Well,
per property.
$500 or whatever it is. I don't know what each grass falls.
Well, it's so much per 100 plants, basically, and you can get it installed. They're just not going to come out for 100 plants. They're going to come out for a whole lot more than that. But you can get pretty much any amount. You can do it yourself, or you can pay them to install it out of Currituck, which is what I would do. Because I would call the company that raises it and give them a one.
And I say we pay for the plants. If you want to pay somebody else to install it, then pay for somebody else to install it. But there are homeowners out there that will plant it.
Yes, there are some, because and there are some companies, my neighbor does a really great job of his property every year. But, I'm a little confused. Is your motion just to give a property owner up to $500 whether they plant it themselves or whether they don't?
Well, how about reimbursement of the product?
Up to $500, whether they plant it on their own or they pay for somebody. But we reimburse after verification of planting.
How many, how far can you go with plants?
Not a lot.
So it's going to be at least 1,000.
It's going to be at least.
How many homeowners, oceanfronts do they have? 300?
Yeah.
So we're looking at 30,000. Right?
150,000, about 30 each. Some people will do it, some people won't, and some people can't. But, I mean, I think the project is a really good thing to do. And I think we endorse this moving forward. Getting the word out there, and the sooner the better. And I think as long as there's $500 available for the property owner, up to $500, I think that's a good thing. Work really well with those people that have single lots, and it won't work quite as well with those people that have multiple lots.
And then the parcel number per multiple lots.
I'd like to suggest moving forward with this project.
What do you, just as presented or with Mike's recommendation, or?
I'd like Mike to state it, Commissioner Sears to state his recommendation.
My recommendation would be to reimburse up to $500. If they only want to plant $500 worth, we'll reimburse the material up to $500.
Okay. Yours is not a match. Yours is just reimburse up to $500. Is
the match better for the homeowner?
It makes any difference.
Tell me, you plant $2,000. Give them $1,000 for $500. So they're going to spend that either way.
Right. If you're going to spend $1,000, you can get half of it back. I think that's a good thing. But
Go along with Commissioners, or Mayor Pro Tem Sears' endorsement of it.
thank you very much.
We reimburse up to $500 to any homeowner that wants, or material of any homeowner that wants to spray or plant.
As long as they spend at least $500, you want to reimburse.
The minimum $500.
It's not a match.
Second.
Okay, so that's a motion and a second to reimburse. Essentially, the modification is that it's no longer a match, that it would be a reimbursement of $500 for the same program, which is planting beach grass.
Which if you're going to spend $1,000, that's the same as.
Okay.
Well,
So,
Yes, Kate, sorry.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt your motion. I just wanted to clarify, but I can wait till after the motion.
Well, I'll clarify for you. The motion is to reimburse or to fund owners $500 for this program, regardless of whether they spend $1,000 or more. We are.
The homeowner can show you they spent $500, that's what you'll pay.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, 400, so yes, up to $500. All right. Everybody understand? That's what we're doing. All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, Kate.
Thank you all.
good work, Kate.
The next item on our agenda are items referred to in presentations from the town attorney.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, I'm sorry.
before that, can we go back to the Better Beaches thing? On
Yes.
this, and where we stand and what the board's wishes is with that? If there's even a wish?
Sure. Yes.
The conversations I've had with you, Better Beaches has been trying to put out plantings, and the money never comes available a lot of times when it's planting season.
Correct.
If we're going to endorse Better Beaches doing the work, let's make sure the money is available during the proper planting season so they can get the work done. Yeah, I think we make it very cumbersome, more than some of the other
For
communities.
them, so what's holding that up, or is it them coming to make a request and us putting that on an agenda? What, if we budget that money, what keeps them? We budget that money in June. What keeps Better Beaches from getting that money in July? Anything?
October.
Early in the planting seasons when they grow like that.
I'm trying to clarify why that's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this started off years ago, and I think we were setting aside about $7,000 for Better Beaches. I'm not sure it was ever formally discussed as part of the budget process. But, yeah, I think we just need a formal, discussion, maybe a motion about how much of our money we want to set aside for better beaches and then develop a program and do that. And, we'll get the money out quickly,
So is there any money in the budget for better beaches?
And there's
Yes, sir.
nothing,
Yes or no?
There's nothing in the budget that's formally set aside for better beaches right now.
We had been paying them initially. Sorry, this is Amy. Oh, okay. Initially, we had just been paying them from the Beach Nourishment Fund. And I think there was sort of just an informal agreement, like Andy had mentioned, up to a certain amount, that they would submit their receipts and then we would pay the vendor directly. So if the board is okay with it, again, there was money left with the sprigging, much like we're going to use for the cost share program, that we could just use the beach nourishment funds for that, if that's what the board wishes. If we, if there's a maximum amount that you want to pay them, but we could just use the beach nourishment funds for that.
What have we paid them in the past? Do we have a history of years past of what we've paid Better Beaches?
We can pull that for you. It's
Yeah,
typically not exceeded $7,000.
It was up to it was up to 5,000. I think that was sort of the informal agreement that we had with them. And so we would just pay them up to that. But so if the board has a certain amount in mind, I don't need a budget adjustment. I would just need to kind of have guidance as what your maximum amount, you would be comfortable with.
Commissioner Fuller.
I'd like to make a motion that we appropriate $7,000 from unappropriated fund balance to make a payment to Better Beaches. And that's it. The details can be worked out by staff.
Okay. So I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?